Hello, my kiddos. Look who's with us today. Be sure to listen to the story. Okay, so last time Gandalf was trying to figure out the password to open the door to Moria, which you guys remember from The Hobbit. Dwarves always make doors that are very tricky to get into. So here we go. At that moment, from far off, the wind bore to their listening ears the howling of wolves. Bill the pony started in fear, and Sam sprang to his side and whispered softly to him. "Do not let him run away," said Boromir. "It seems that we shall need him still if the wolves do not find us. How I hate this foul pool." He stooped, and picking up a large stone, he cast it far into the dark water. The stone vanished with a soft slap, but at the same instant there was a swish and a bubble. Great rippling rings formed on the surface out beyond where the stone had fallen, and they moved slowly towards the foot of the cliff. "Why did you do that, Boromir?" said Frodo. "I hate this place too, and I am afraid. I don't know of what. Not of wolves or the dark behind the doors, but of something else. I am afraid of the pool. Do not disturb it." "I wish we could get away," said Merry. "Why doesn't Gandalf do something quick?" said Pippin. Gandalf took no notice of them. He sat with his head bowed, either in despair or in anxious thought. The mournful howling of the wolves was heard again. The ripples on the water grew and came closer. Some were already lapping on the shore. With a suddenness that startled them all, the wizard sprang to his feet. He was laughing. "I have it!" he cried. Of course, absurdly simple. Like most riddles when you see the answer." Picking up his staff, he stood before the rock and said in a clear voice, "Melon!" The star shone out briefly and faded again. Then silently a great doorway was outlined, though not a crack or joint had been visible before. Slowly it divided in the middle and swung outwards, inch by inch, until both doors lay back against the wall. Through the opening a shadowy stair could be seen climbing steeply up, but beyond the lower steps the darkness was deeper than the night. The company stared and wondered. "I was wrong after all," said Gandalf, "and Gimli too. Merry, of all people, was on the right track. The opening word was inscribed on the archway all the time. The translation should have been, 'Say friend and enter.' I only had to speak the Elvish word for friend, and the doors opened. Quite simple. Too simple for a learned lore master in these suspicious days. Those were happier times. Now let's go." He strode forward and set his foot on the lowest step, but at that moment several things happened. Frodo felt something seize him by the ankle, and he fell with a cry. Bill the pony gave a wild neigh of fear and turned tail and dashed away along the lakeside into the darkness. Sam leaped after him, and then hearing Frodo's cry, he ran back again, weeping and cursing. The others swung round and saw the waters of the lake seething as if a host of snakes were swimming up the southern end. Out from the water a long, sinuous tentacle had crawled. It was pale green and luminous and wet. Its fringed end had a hold of Frodo's foot and was dragging him into the water. Sam, on his knees, was now slashing at it with a knife. The arm let go of Frodo, and Sam pulled him away, crying out for help. 20 other arms came rippling out. The dark water boiled, and there was a hideous stench. "Into the gateway, up the stairs, quick!" shouted Gandalf, leaping back. Rousing them from the horror that seemed to have rooted all but Sam to the ground where they stood, he drove them forward. They were just in time. Sam and Frodo were only a few steps up, and Gandalf had just begun to climb when the groping tentacles writhed across the narrow shore and fingered the cliff wall and the doors. One came wriggling over the threshold, glistening in the starlight. Gandalf turned and paused. If he was considering what word would close the gate again from within, there was no need. Many coiling arms seized the doors on either side and with horrible strength swung them round. With a shattering echo they slammed, and all light was lost. A noise of rending and crashing came dully through the ponderous stone. Sam, clinging to Frodo's arm, collapsed on a step in the black darkness. "Poor old Bill," he said, in a choking voice. "Poor old Bill. Wolves and snakes, but the snakes were too much for him. I had to choose, Mr. Frodo. I had to come with you." They heard Gandalf go back down the steps and thrust his staff against the doors. There was a quiver in the stone, and the stairs trembled, but the doors did not open. "Well, well," said the wizard. "The passage is blocked behind us now, and there is only one way out, on the other side of the mountains. I fear from the sounds that boulders have been piled up and the trees uprooted and thrown across the gate. I am sorry, for the trees were beautiful and had stood so long. I felt that something horrible was near from the moment that my foot first touched the water," said Frodo. "What was the thing, or were there many of them?" "I do not know," answered Gandalf, "but the arms were all guided by one purpose. Something has crept or has been driven out of the dark waters under the mountains. There are older and fouler things than orcs in the deep places of the world." He did not speak aloud his thought that whatever it was that dwelt in the lake, it had seized on Frodo first among all the company. So that's probably because Frodo was carrying the ring, and evil things are attracted to the ring. Boromir muttered under his breath, but the echoing stone magnified the sound to a hoarse whisper that all could hear. "In the deep places of the world, and thither we are going against my wish. Who will lead us now in this deadly dark?" "I will," said Gandalf, "and Gimli shall walk with me. Follow my staff." As the wizard passed on ahead up the great steps, he held his staff aloft, and from its tip there came a faint radiance. The wide stairway was sound and undamaged. 200 steps they counted, broad and shallow, and at the top they found an arched passage with a level floor leading on into the dark. "Let us sit and rest and have something to eat here on the landing, since we can't find a dining room," said Frodo. He had begun to shake off the terror of the clutching arm, and suddenly he felt extremely hungry. The proposal was welcomed by all, and they sat down on the upper steps, dim figures in the room. After they had eaten, Gandalf gave them each a third sip of the Mirror of Rivendell. "It will not last much longer, I am afraid," he said, "but I think we need it after that horror at the gate. And unless we have great luck, we shall need all that is left before we see the other side. Go carefully with the water, too. There are many streams and wells in the mines, but they should not be touched. We may not have a chance of filling our skins and bottles till we come down into Dimrill Dale." "How long is that going to take us?" asked Frodo. "I cannot say," answered Gandalf. "It depends on many chances, but going straight, without mishap or losing our way, we shall take 3 or 4 marches, I expect. It cannot be less than 40 miles from the west door to the east gate in a direct line, and the road may wind much." After only a brief rest, they started on their way again. All were eager to get the journey over as quickly as possible, and were willing, tired as they were, to go on marching still for several hours. Gandalf walked in front as before. In his left hand he held up his glimmering staff, the light of which was just shone. In his left hand he held up his glimmering staff, the light of which just showed the ground before his feet. In his right he held his sword, Glamdring. Behind him came Gimli, his eyes glinting in the dim light as he turned his head from side to side. Behind the dwarf walked Frodo, and he had drawn the short sword Sting. No gleam came from the blade of Sting or of Glamdring, and that was some comfort, for being the work of elvish smiths in the elder days, these swords shone with a cold light if any orcs were near at hand. Behind Frodo went Sam, and after him Legolas, and the young hobbits and Boromir. In the dark at the rear, grim and silent, walked Aragorn. The passage twisted round a few turns and then began to descend. It was steadily down for a long while before it became level once again. The air grew hot and stifling. But it was not foul, and at times they felt currents of cooler air upon their faces, issuing from half-guessed openings in the walls. There were many of these. In the pale ray of the wizard's staff, Frodo caught glimpses of stairs and arches, and of other passages and tunnels sloping up, or running steeply down, or opening blankly, dark on either side. It was bewildering beyond hope of remembering. Gimli aided Gandalf very little, except by his stout courage. At least he was not, as were most of the others, troubled by the mere darkness in itself. Often the wizard consulted him at points where the choice of way was doubtful, but it was always Gandalf who had the final word. The mines of Moria were vast and intricate beyond the imagination of Gimli, Gloin's son, dwarf of the mountain race though he was. To Gandalf, the far-off memories of a journey long before were now of little help. But even in the gloom and despite all the windings of the road, he knew whither he wished to go, and he did not falter as long as there was a path that led towards his goal. "Do not be afraid," said Aragorn. There was a pause longer than usual, and Gandalf and Gimli were whispering together. The others were crowded behind, waiting anxiously. "Do not be afraid. I have been with him on many a journey, if never once so dark, and there are tales in Rivendell of greater deeds of his than any that I have seen. He will not go astray. If there is any path to find, he has led us in here against our fears, but he will lead us out again, and at whatever cost to himself. He is surer of finding the way home in a blind night than the cats of Queen Beruthiel. It was well for the company that they had such a guide. They had no fuel for any means of making torches. In the desperate scramble at the doors, many things had been left behind. But without any light, they would soon have come to grief. There were not only many roads to choose from, there were also in many places holes and pitfalls, and dark wells beside the path in which their passing feet echoed. There were fissures and chasms in the walls and floor, and every now and then a crack would open right before their feet. The widest was more than 7 feet across, and it was long before Pippin could summon enough courage to leap over the dreadful gap. The noise of churning water came up from far below, as if some great mill wheel was turning in the depths. "Rope," muttered Sam. "I knew I'd want it, if I hadn't got it." As those dangers became more frequent, their march became slower. Already they seemed to have been tramping on endlessly to the mountain's roots. They were more than weary, and yet there seemed no comfort in the thought of halting anywhere. Frodo's spirit had risen for a while after his escape, and after food and a draught of the cordial, but now a deep uneasiness, growing to dread, crept over him again. Though he had been healed in Rivendell of the knife stroke, that grim wound had not been without effect. His senses were sharper and more aware of things that could not be seen. One sign of change that he soon had noticed was that he could see more in the dark than any of his companions, save perhaps Gandalf. And he was in any case the bearer of the ring. It hung upon its chain against his breast, and at whiles it seemed a heavy weight. He felt the certainty of evil ahead and of evil following, but he said nothing. He gripped tighter on the hilt of his sword and went on doggedly. The company behind him spoke seldom, and then only in hurried whispers. There was no sound but the sound of their own feet. The dull stump of Gimli's dwarf boots, the heavy tread of Boromir, the light step of Legolas, the soft, scarce heard patter of hobbit feet, and in the rear the slow, firm footfalls of Aragorn with his long stride. When they halted for a moment, they heard nothing at all, unless it were occasionally a faint trickle and drip of unseen water. Yet Frodo began to hear, or to imagine that he heard, something else, like the faint fall of soft, bare feet. It was never loud enough, or near enough, for him to feel certain that he heard it. But once it had started, it never stopped, while the company was moving. But it was not an echo, for when they halted, it pattered on for a little. All by itself, and then grew still. It was after nightfall when they had entered the mines. They had been going for several hours, with only brief halts, when Gandalf came to his first serious check. Before him stood a wide, dark arch, opening into 3 passages. All led in the same general direction, eastward. The left-hand passage plunged down, while the right-hand climbed up, and the middle way seemed to run on, smooth and level, but very narrow. "I have no memory of this place at all," said Gandalf, standing uncertainly under the arch. He held up his staff on the hope of finding some marks or inscriptions that might help his choice, but nothing of the kind was to be seen. "I am too weary to decide," he said, shaking his head, "and I expect that you are all as weary as I am, or wearier. We had better halt here for what is left of the night. You know what I mean. In here it is ever dark, but outside the late moon is riding westward and the middle night has passed." "Poor old Bill," said Sam. "I wonder where he is. I hope those wolves haven't gotten him yet." To the left of the great arch they found the stone door. It was half closed but swung back easily to a gentle thrust. Beyond there seemed to lie a wide chamber cut in the rock. "Steady, steady!" cried Gandalf as Merry and Pippin pushed forward, glad to find a place where they could rest with at least more feeling of shelter than in the open passage. "Steady! You do not know what is inside yet. I will go first." He went in cautiously and the others filed behind. "There," he said, pointing with his staff to the middle of the floor. Before his feet he saw a large round hole like the mouth of a well. Broken and rusty chains lay at the edge and trailed down into the black pit. Fragments of stone lay near. "One of you might have fallen in and still be wondering when you were going to strike the bottom," said Aragorn to Merry. "Let the guide go first while you have one." "This seems to have been a guard room, made for the watching of the 3 passages," said Gimli. "That hole was plainly a well for the guard's use, covered with a stone lid, but the lid is broken, and we must all take care in the dark." Pippin felt curiously attracted by the well. While the others were unrolling blankets and making beds against the walls of the chamber, as far as possible from the hole in the floor, he crept to the edge and peered over. A chill air seemed to strike his face, rising from the invisible depths. Moved by a sudden impulse, he groped for a loose stone and let it drop. He felt his heart beat many times before there was any sound. Then far below, as if the stone had fallen into deep water in some cavernous place, there came a plunk, very distant, but magnified and repeated in the hollow shaft. "What was that?" cried Gandalf. He was relieved when Pippin confessed what he had done, but he was angry, and Pippin could see his eye glinting. "Fool of a Took," he growled. "This is a serious journey, not a hobbit walking party. Throw yourself in next time, and then you will be no further nuisance. Now be quiet." Nothing more was heard for several minutes, but then there came up from the depths faint knocks. Tom tap, tap tom. They stopped, and when the echoes had died away, they were repeated. Tap tom, tom tap, tap tap, tom. They sounded disquietingly like signals of some sort, but after a while the knocking died away and was not heard again. "That was the sound of a hammer," "Or I have never heard one," said Gimli. And Gimli would know, because he's a dwarf. "Yes," said Gandalf, "and I do not like it. It may have nothing to do with Peregrine's foolish stone, but probably something has been disturbed that would have been better left quiet. Pray do nothing of the kind again. Let us hope we shall get rest without further trouble. You, Pippin, can go on the first watch as a reward," he growled as he rolled himself into a blanket. Pippin sat miserably by the door in the pitch dark, but he kept on turning round, fearing that some unknown thing would crawl up out of the well. He wished he could cover the hole, if only with a blanket, but he dared not move or go near it, even though Gandalf seemed to be asleep. Actually, Gandalf was awake, though lying still and silent. He was deep in thought, trying to recall every memory of his former journey in the mines, and considering anxiously the next course that he should take. A false turn now might be disastrous. After an hour he rose up and came over to Pippin. "Get into a corner and have a sleep, my lad," he said in a kindly tone. "You want to sleep, I expect. I cannot get a wink, so I may as well do the watching." "I know what is the matter with me," he muttered as he sat down by the door. "I need smoke. I have not tasted it since the morning before the snowstorm." The last thing that Pippin saw, as sleep took him, was a dark glimpse of the old wizard huddled on the floor, shielding a glowing chip in his gnarled hands between his knees. The flicker for a moment showed his sharp nose and the puff of smoke. All right, that's it for now, kiddos. I love you always and forever, no matter what.